We're at a place called Angkor in Cambodia, where they've got an amazing national park here, and we're at a centre here called the Angkor Centre for Conservation Biodiversity. They are doing some amazing stuff here with animals. They get a lot of injured animals get brought in. Unlike a lot of places that take injured animals and keep them forever so tourists can do selfies, these guys release them back in the wild. Gonna go in here, meet up with these guys and see what they do. Should be quite cool. Hello. What was your name? Chun. Chun. Pete, nice to meet you. And this is the Dan. How are you, Dan?
Hey, Pete. Good to see you.
We're doing a podcast with you later today, aren't we?
Yeah, unfortunately.
You want to go and check this out? Sure. That's quite cool, them doing education on kids. In many ways, I find old people are so hard to convert to, you know, driving a smaller car or stopping using plastic and things, but kids are much more malleable. And it's much easier to go converting them and getting them thinking about conservation messages and animals and wildlife and looking after the planet. And so I think, you know, in the long term, the hope is that you can inspire enough young kids that are going to grow up to be politicians and government people and police and that, and make the world a better place. This is one of the biggest birds I've ever seen, called a Saras crane, found in the areas around here. This guy has an interesting story. Apparently he started to have a few, I think the guy termed it mental issues, and they decided to, the government initiated a thing to have him rescued from the wild and brought here. They had him free range. He would chase the dogs around, and so in the end they put him in this enclosure here and they clip his wings every 6 months to keep him in here, but occasionally he still gets out, goes out the front gate and starts hassling the dogs again. And apparently he got quite used to human food, and he started wandering into the kitchen and wreaking a bit of havoc there. So they put him in here. So these birds are a sort of shallow wading bird, and they go out and feed. And the area here, when the monsoon comes in and the Mekong River raises and it floods all these floodplains, but then as the water starts to recede, it opens up all of these areas to birds like this to come in, where you've got these new shoots coming up and lots of little wee fish and insects that suddenly become available to them. And so they're part of the migration here, as these birds will migrate from one area to next through the year. Down here we have the Southeast Asian box turtle. Often these are taken to monks and handed over as a gift in exchange for a blessing. So quite often they've got a program here where they're trying to educate the monks about the wildlife and how to conserve it, and that maybe you shouldn't be accumulating all these turtles.
Are these endangered, or they have big numbers?
These are classed as vulnerable, so not endangered or critically endangered, but still threatened. Here we have a smooth-coated otter. Really interesting story on this guy. So one of the guys that was working here, his girlfriend saw it on the side of the road on a leash with a guy taken along. The team here went and they convinced the guy to go giving the otter here. Now apparently originally this otter was caught, it was one of 4 or 5 babies and a mother that got caught in a fish trap, and the fisherman took the lot of them and then he sold the babies off to different places. This guy had the otter, had it for a couple of years, and then eventually the facility here managed to get him. He's the only one they have here. They're hoping to get a female from somewhere at some stage and breed them. Plus is vulnerable, not a huge number of them left, but not endangered yet. But again, these guys would be affected by things like habitat loss, and also, you know, people like, in this case, taking them as pets sort of thing. The interesting bit was the owner, he came back a year or 2 later and it no longer recognised him, whereas when they first brought the otter here, the otter would recognise the owner. He got upset when anyone else would get near him, but he was super happy with the owner. But anyway, so he's here now. He looks pretty happy now, waiting to find himself a lady, and then he might get some action. Beautiful animal, eh? One of the things with animals like otter, one of the common things in wildlife is that generally intelligence is associated with predation. Most predators need a certain amount of intelligence. There's a few exceptions. Reptiles rely more on instinct than intelligence. So a snake, for example, generally aren't very clever, but an animal like this, probably going to be super smart, I reckon. This guy's got, I haven't seen many otters, but he's got an enormously big tail, which, you know, the tail sort of works when they're going through the water. It's what sort of pushes them along, but this guy's got massive tail on him. sort of having big abs or big guns. Like Eric. Eric's been working on his guns lately. We've got behind me here 2 pileated gibbons. These are 2 males. Again, these were bought, they were taken as pets and rescued, bought here. Primates are really hard to release back in the wild. Generally, if they've been kept for a pet for anything, any substantial period of time, you cannot release them back into the wild. They just don't, once they make that human connection. So these guys here, destined to stay in here indefinitely probably, and same with the female and the one over there. They are working on a program. I think they've got maybe 7 or 8 of these, so they're hoping to pair them off. These animals here, they mate for life, so they will form a couple when they reach kind of sexual maturity, and the 2 of them will hang out as a couple in the jungle in their own little territory, and they'll defend that territory. And behind me here is called the greater adjutant. Unusual name for a bird. There's only about 1,000 of them left in the world, and they've got this pair. They came together about 8 or 9 years ago, and they've been trying to get them to breed. Finally, last year, the female produced 2 eggs. What's that?
This year.
Oh, this year. This year, the female produced 2 eggs, and unfortunately, one fell through the nest, the other one got trampled on, and so there was no babies. But this bird hasn't been studied very much. They don't know a lot about it, even though there's only 1,000 left. Partly because it's really only found, I think it's here and in Thailand is where it's found. Oh, Vietnam has a couple in a zoo as well. But anyway, this place here, one of the leading places to hopefully try and get these breeding in captivity so that you can release them into the wild and help that wild population. A freaky looking bird. It's got this great big, I don't know if you can see it, that great big sort of gel thing hanging under its neck. And the scientists still haven't figured out 100% what it's for. It could be for body temperature regulation, and that they're in very hot climates, are a very big bird. Birds generate a lot of heat when they're flying, a lot of energy, oxygen burning through the system. Could be something like that, but either that or it could just be like a big booty. Although they've both got it, so not sure on that. Big bird though, eh? You can't see him, but in the box behind me there is a Malayan porcupine. There's a really interesting thing on porcupine. The animal in Cambodia has been hunted for the stomachs, and the stomachs are used for treatment. I think it's after women have given birth in the recovery process. It can help them, and it's a Cambodian traditional recipe, remedy type thing. We did some patrols in Sumatra, and we kept coming across little snares that were set for porcupine, and the rangers explained to us that in Indonesia they target the porcupine. 1 in 4 or 5 has a thing called a bezoar stone, which is a small organic stone that grows inside the stomachs of them. It's used in a traditional medicine in Vietnam and China to treat, amongst other things, cancer. But the crazy thing is it's only in 1 or 4 or 5, so you go and kill a porcupine and you get about $100, oh no, I think you get about $400 to $500 per bezoar stone. In here we have a couple of lesser adjutants. You could say that it was a bit unfair they call these guys lesser. Don't know why, maybe it's because they missed out on the big growth underneath, I don't know, but maybe a little bit smaller than the other one, but cool looking bird. Look a bit like the gazas. We caught a poacher last year who'd shot a gaza bird in the Amazon. Kind of similar, very elegant birds, the way they go walking around. I haven't seen any fly yet, but presumably they're going to have a great big wingspan. Greater adjutants have a wingspan fully grown just under 3 meters. Very big bird. These guys here, they've released a couple of these a while ago to the wild, and they had a breeding program building up the numbers. I think they've got 30 something now, and they've got plans to keep releasing them back into the wild. Very cool. Check that out. Behind me here we have a long-tailed macaque in this enclosure. They've also got a pig-tailed macaque as well. Interesting thing with macaques. Isn't that cool? Isn't that amazing? Anyway, the macaques, they make great pets when they're young. So there's a big illegal trade in these animals here. People get them for pets as babies, taken from the wild. Then they grow up. Testosterone starts kicking in. They get aggressive. They start hassling their owner. And so people decide what do they do with them. They've got a few options. They can release them back into the wild. Primates, there's a lot of learning skills, what to eat, what predators to avoid, social skills of being in a family. And if that primate is raised with humans, it lacks all those skills. So it's very difficult to go releasing in the wild and it being successful. Second option is sometimes they get taken to some of the temples where there's other macaques, but then you're putting them in a new primate group. Fights and scuffles and can be booted out of the group, might be accepted, bit of a lottery. The third option is you can bring them to a wildlife centre like this. But the trouble is, these guys are not endangered, and a wildlife conservation centre like this, limited amount of resource. Are you going to spend your money keeping these animals alive, or are you going to go putting your money into other animals that are endangered or critically endangered or threatened? And it's a really tough call to make. And this centre here, they've sort of made the choice that there's a lot of other things they can be putting their money into rather than these guys. So they commit to the ones that they have. They are going to continue with them. But because it's really difficult to release these back in the wild successfully, they're kind of stuck with these guys, and it ties up an enormous amount of money, resource, food, time, space, enclosures, maintenance. And it's a dilemma that all sort of wildlife rescue places face. And it was interesting when I was talking with the guy before, and he was sort of saying how they see themselves as a conservation centre, and the German foundation that puts money in here, it's put in for conservation purposes. And so it's a very tough decision. What are you going to put your money into? As a conservation centre, you want to try and probably focus on critically endangered and endangered animals. Not so much on animals like these, which are, not threatened at all. But it's a shame, we've got to stop using these guys as pets, stop taking them out of the wild. Oh, the other issue with releasing back in the wild too, one of the points that was made was you've got an animal that might have been brought from one region that has a disease that population has developed immunity to. You take it to another area 500 kilometres away, because you don't know where that animal originally came from. Take it to a new area, introduces a new disease, and you've created havoc in the environment. So these animals, very tough to go releasing back in the wild, and as a general rule, it's handled very, very carefully. Cool animals though, clever. You see him, one of them was sitting down similar where that guy was now, and you could see the intelligence in their eyes, like enormously clever, these guys. Very social animals too. That's one of the things with primates, is primates are they've got a very strong social fabric, and their position in that social fabric is important. Where do they sit in the family? Are they the sort of the matriarch or the patriarch or the cheeky young brother, or the almost like humans. Anyway, see you, mate. They seem quite indifferent to us, eh? Much more interested in their own. Like, you'll see them look around, then they'll be looking up at their brother or cousin. Auntie? What's Auntie doing up there? Auntie? Silly old lady. Interesting about this place here is it's not open to the public, and that's quite unusual. And this is really what a rehabilitation place should be like. They don't allow people to go in there and take selfies. And that's probably one of the worst aspects of tourism right now, is people go around, they're obsessed with getting out selfies with endangered animals and snakes and tigers and all the rest of it. And it's been a real privilege. We were lucky to get in here. We talked them into giving us this private little tour. In some ways, this could be the model for how wildlife rehabilitation facilities should be run. But the challenge is, how do you fund them? So when you go getting a place that goes and does selfies, that's how they make their money, and that's how they fund it. But in many ways, they become prostitutes, and it ends up becoming one of the worst. It's worse for conservation. This is the ideal model. It's well funded out of Germany. They do the odd private tour, and they're really focused on the animals. But it costs a lot of money to run a facility like this, and not easy, eh?